We have Sarah Anderson joining us. Sarah is a PhD candidate in the Entomology and Nematology department at the University of Florida. She specializes in native bees and pollinator ecology. Her research focuses on understanding the impact of climate warming and land use change on native pollinators. And tonight she's going to teach us some of Florida's 300 plus native bee species. So please welcome Sarah Anderson.
Without further ado, so my name is Sarah Anderson, and Sarah Anderson Weaver. I actually just got married like a week and a half ago, so that's new. Woo! Yeah, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Mallinger Lab. So I am currently working on my dissertation research, as Mandy said, that involves looking at how climate change in various aspects affects pollinator health and wellness. You can reach out to me at email at any point in time, and also on Instagram for lots of cool bee pictures. You can find me. Cool. Ooh, also, whoever phone is up here, it is going off. Is this your phone? Okay. So today I'm going to first cover a little bit about the diversity of bees. We're going to take a pop quiz, everybody, looking at whether or not something is a bee and whether or not we can identify that. Then we're going to talk about the top 10 most observed bee species here in Florida. And finally, we're going to move into discussing a little bit about bee conservation with a particular emphasis on what we as individuals can do in our homes and gardens and communities. Wonderful. So, does anybody want to give me a guess? How many bee species do we have here in Florida? 200. Over 300, but yes, like 323. Is that on the worksheet? Is that on the handout? Okay, good. I was like, is that on the handout? Because I think that's something we might have put on there. Also, you'll see Shiala's actually an author on that handout, so she might have put that info on there. Oh, yep, I thought. All right, what about in the United States as a whole? How many species of bees do we have? 500, 10,000. Any other guesses? Cheating from the worksheet, 4,000. You got it. Cheater from the worksheet in the back. Yes, I love that. All right, and finally, in the world, how many bee species do we have? Not on the worksheet. Not on the worksheet. Uh-oh. Exactly. We have 20,000, actually over 20,000, and adding new species all the time. We have a lot of wonderful bee taxonomists around the world who are constantly putting up information and discovering new species of bees every year. It's pretty amazing. Let's see here. And this diversity, I mean, it comes in all shapes, all sizes, all colors, all butts, And so the first question we kind of need to ask ourselves, right, when we see something out in our gardens or in the field, and we're like, oh, is it a bee? Is that one of our crazy bee species that we have that we've never seen before, maybe? Because, how are we going to keep track of all 323 here in Florida as individuals, right? So I'm going to first talk about a few of the characteristics that can separate bees from other common pollinators that you'll see visiting flowers, such as flies and wasps, which actually, serve a lot of the same purposes as bees and can have very similar appearances. So first of all, for flies versus bees, flies, one of the main characteristics of them is that they only have one pair of wings. So they have this pair here, but they don't have a secondary pair of wings. Additionally, they have those like large bulging fly eyes that you think of. And those eyes typically touch in the center, whereas a bee's eyes don't touch in the center because they actually have additional light sensing organs in between their eyes. And then finally, they'll have relatively short antenna, so short and stubby, as opposed to that like classic elbowed look that you think of with bees or wasps. And they'll have relatively hairless and often thinner legs. So one group of flies that we often confuse as bees are actually bee mimics, like this one. So this is in the family Bumbleidae. And as you can see, it kind of looks maybe like a bumblebee, but it has those long, skinny, hairless legs. So bee legs are covered in thick, wonderful hair for collecting pollen, and flies don't collect pollen, and so thus they don't have that same like really hairy structure on their legs. Oh, are we still having the bees passed around? Yeah. Has this side of the room seen them? Who hasn't seen the bees? Raise your hand. I know, it's hard with 3 boxes. Okay. Okay, they're coming. There is a large robber fly that looks like a bumblebee, yes. And one of the ways that you can distinguish it is that the robber flies have sort of a thinner, longer body. And again, they're not going to have those pollen collecting hairs on their legs. Also, their eyes will often touch in the center of their heads, whereas the bumblebees are very much separated. Ooh, entomology pop quiz for me. The knobby structure on in lieu of the second wing for the fly is actually called the haltere. So, and all Diptera have halteres. Yes, that is the distinguishing character for that order. So, I feel like I'm at the entomology quiz bowl that we have every year for the Entomology Society of America. All right, so wasp versus bees. So these are often confused as bees, but you'll see that wasps typically, again, they have less hair. Wasps and flies do not collect pollen typically. So they do not have those pollen collecting hairs that are so important for bees to be able to do what bees do. Additionally, you'll see them in bright colors, although that is not always a tell, because for those of you who have the worksheet, the sweat bees, the first one on there is this neon bright metallic green bee. So it's not always a tell, but often wasps will be more brightly colored. Additionally, they'll have longer antennae than a bee will, so it's sort of hard to tell comparatively, but if you see them side by side, you're like, oh, these are all out here feeling for prey, right? Whereas since bees, they're not hunting, they're just searching for flowers, they have shorter antennae. And then finally, again, because wasps are out hunting for prey, they have these really wicked spurs on their legs. These, right? So they actually grasp prey with those after they sting it to take it back to their nest. So bees, of course, don't have that because they're vegetarian and they forage on flowers exclusively. So, all right, now we're ready for the pop quiz, I think. Oh, I just wanted to show this because a lot of times I'll hear people saying, oh, I have all these bees surrounding me at my picnic, but they're actually yellow jackets. And one of the best ways to tell a yellow jacket apart from a honeybee is that really, really intense yellow coloration. Again, they have hairless legs with spurs, whereas honeybees have pollen collecting baskets and they're very furry. Those are kind of the main tells. All right, so here's how we're going to do this because I did not bring any sort of remote clicking or technological devices to help us vote. We're going to do our right hand for yes, and our left hand for no. And we're going to say, is it a bee? Yes or no. Okay? Is everyone going to participate? Yes. Good. You guys get it. You got it. Okay. Is it a bee? No, of course it's not. What is this? It's a wasp. It's your typical paper wasp that you see sort of dangling around your academic buildings or your house, pestering you in doorways, right? And for the wasps, how could we come to this conclusion? Does anybody want to tell me? Based on those characters that I just mentioned. Exactly. Long antenna, spines on the legs. Exactly. And no hair on the legs. That's exactly right. Okay. Is it a bee? It's okay. Let's see. No, you guys are voting no. Great. I was like, oh. Okay, and what is this? It's a fly. And how do we know it's a fly? Exactly. We just have that one pair of wings and the eyes touching in the center of the head, these big bulging eyes. Also, you can see these teeny tiny antennae. Do you see those? They're just really, really, you almost can't see them, right? Exactly. All right, have we all seen the bees? Have you seen the bees in the boxes, the specimens? Okay, good. All right, is it a bee? Nice, yes. And this is actually my favorite bee, which I will tell you guys all about as we go along. How can we tell that this is a bee? Furry legs, that'll do it, furry legs. And I mean, it really gives itself away. There's pollen all over those furry legs, right? So we know that this is a bee. All right, last one. Is it a bee? No. Does anyone remember what it is? What family of fly it is? You're so close. Yes, Bumbleidae. So close. So this is actually a bumblebee mimic. And how do we know that it's not a bumblebee? Legs, yes. Short antennae, skinny hairless legs, one pair of wings, exactly. Right. They are really cute, and they're important pollinators. You can actually see that there is in fact pollen stuck to the hair of this fly. Okay, so now we've answered, is it a bee? But which bee is it? That's the question, right? So now I'm going to move into talking about the top 10 observed bee species here in Florida. And what I mean by that is I've actually, does anyone here use iNaturalist? Yes, I love it. Everybody should be on there. It's such a good like community science app. I love it. I took all of the iNaturalist observations of bees and I downloaded them and excluded honeybees. And these are the top 10 species that are observed. So yeah, this is new data for you guys. And they're not necessarily in numerical order, but they will have a number next to them that indicates what their ranking is, but they're actually grouped by their relatedness to one another. First, I want to make a plug that honeybees are not native bees, although they are the most commonly observed bee. They are incredibly important for commercial agricultural production here in Florida, and there are certain industries that we have, such as blueberry, that really couldn't function without them. So they're important, but they're not native, and I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about them today. There are other honeybee experts, and you can go to bee college if you're really interested. Has anybody gone to bee college here? Yes, kind of in the back. Yeah. So, you know, if you're interested in honeybee keeping or honeybees, there are a lot of resources for that. A lot of people who spend their whole lives just working on that. But today I'm going to talk about native bees instead. So the first group are the sweat bees, and they are just awesome for a variety of reasons. They pollinate all sorts of things. They're solitary. So unlike honeybees, each female produces her own eggs and then provisions those offspring with pollen and nectar herself. So there's no queen, there's no collective, it's just a female having her offspring, sort of similar to how you would think of most beetle species, maybe. And additionally, they nest in the ground. So unlike honeybees that have these big hives or bumblebees that have smaller colonies, these are digging individual holes in the ground where they lay their eggs, and then they seal those holes where the eggs develop. So it's sort of their life cycle. So this is on the handout for those of you who have it, sweat bees. The #1 observed bee here in Florida is Agapostemon splendens, or the green sweat bee. Oh, you guys can't see. I just realized.
Yeah, it's a little off center.
It's a little off. Oh, I wonder if, is this better? So you can see the whole thing? Okay. Perfect. Okay, we'll just do it this way. So, Agapostemon splendens, the green sweat bee. And this bee is this beautiful bright metallic color. You can see the male here on the far left, and actually the female who does not have stripes here in the middle photograph. I actually took this photo recently at the Loch Lusa Wildlife Management Area, which is it's a pretty great place. And it's actually foraging on the small butterwort here, which I think is really cool because I love carnivorous plants, probably like many of you. And then the third most common bee species that we have here in Florida is actually Helicopyi or Poyai's bee. And you can see here, it's just sort of a small, nondescript, brownish blackish bee with stripes. And that classic bee look, right, has those little stripes. And I always like to think of them, they look like they're wearing little pant sets because of how the pollen sticks to their legs. And I don't know why they look like that more than other bees, but they certainly do. Okay. All right, so everybody's favorite group, the bumblebees. So bumblebees, unlike our sweat bees, are actually social. However, they do have perennial colonies as opposed to like honeybees where they have, or I'm sorry, they have annual colonies. Right. I'm getting my words mixed. They have a colony that only lasts 1 year. Plant people, help me. Annual. I mixed myself up here on my PowerPoint slide. They have annual colonies as opposed to perennial colonies like what a honeybee has. And just to give you guys an idea of what that looks like, so you can see what happens here is that over the spring and summer, a colony starts to develop. And at the end of that summer, in the fall, the queen of that colony lays eggs that will be queens. And then those queens fly off, they hibernate over the winter, the colony dies, and then they, the next spring, come out of their little burrows wherever they spent the winter, and they begin their own colony. So that's why you'll see in the early spring a lot of really large bumblebee queens that as the summer progresses, they start to apparently get smaller because now they're workers. So after they start developing workers, the queens stay in the colony and they just continue to lay eggs until that colony is dead. So it's kind of an interesting life cycle. And the three most common bumblebees that we have here in Florida are Bombus impatiens, Bombus pennsylvanicus, and Bombus griseoculus. So I put this photo here, the smaller one, just to show the size difference between a queen and a worker bumblebee in the Bombus impatiens species. But how you tell bumblebees apart, in part, is very reliant on the hair patterns. So you can see here for Bombus impatiens, we have this sort of bright yellow hair, and it's really only covering that first section of the abdomen, so the third section of its body, and then it's all black hair after that. Whereas for Bombus pennsylvanicus, we see this sort of characteristic W of black hair at the beginning, some segments of yellow, and then black hair at the end. And for griseoculus, we see an entirely different pattern. And if you're interested in bumblebee identification specifically, I think we have 6 species that are seen regularly here in Florida. And we have a really, really great UF-IFAS document that actually talks about those hair patterns so that you can identify bumblebees that you might see by sight in the field or in your gardens. And, oh, go ahead, yes.
So you can see it on the Bombus griseoculus.
Mm-hmm.
There's that kind of shiny patch.
Yes.
It's kind of like a knife if you're seeing it fly around. Why is that shiny there?
That's actually a bald patch. Yeah, it just doesn't have hair there. Yeah.
Tends to be where a lot of the anthers will touch down, right here on the back.
Mm-hmm.
That would be hair.
Yeah, so this is just one of those features about bumblebees. They have different hair patterns, and actually someone earlier, remind me of your name here. Next to you. Lori, yes, thank you. Lori was asking earlier about a bee that she's seen, and she said the abdomen, this third section, is less hairy, maybe more shiny. And that's just a result of no hair being there. So insects in general, they have these like shiny exoskeletons, and that's the only reason why. It's just the way that the bumblebee evolved its particular patch of hair. And actually, the shiniest group of bees that are really bald are the Carpenter Bees, which are the next group. So who here has Carpenter Bees at their house, maybe chewing holes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It can be frustrating, but they're really wonderful pollinators. So try to resist the temptation of removing them if you can. I know, it's hard. Yeah. So Carpenter Bees are, they're fantastic. They're one of my favorite groups of bees. They also, so unlike bumblebees, they look similar to bumblebees, but typically they have less hair, very shiny exoskeletons that you can see kind of from a mile away. They'll catch you like a glint as they're flying by sometimes. They're solitary. So again, each female is producing her own eggs and provisioning those eggs with pollen and nectar. They nest in wood, as most of us know. They chew their own holes. So a lot of bee species that nest in cavities actually will reuse the holes of beetles or other wood-boring insects. But carpenter bees always chew a new hole. And finally, and my favorite feature about them is that the males are territorial. So they will sort of zip around and they'll look at you. Has anybody ever experienced this? Yes. It's so funny. They're very aggressive and they're guarding their territory. So they're coming to you and checking out whether or not you're another competitive male carpenter bee. Yeah, they're pretty funny. But just so you know, the males of any bees cannot sting. So you don't have to fear them. I mean, you could kind of pop them out of the air if you wanted to. They can't do anything to you except for look tough, I guess is the best way to describe it, right? So anyways, carpenter bees are super common here in Florida, and especially in the early spring. And this is one of the reasons that I, from personal observation, say if you have carpenter bees, try to leave them alone, particularly if you have the Xylic, because it's one of the first pollinators that's active in the spring, and it's pretty important for pollinating early spring natives, where other things really aren't out and about yet. So the Xylic female, or the southern carpenter bee, has a restricted range, so they really are just southern bees. And you can see she's all black and this like beautiful iridescent blue color. And yeah, the photo doesn't really capture it well, but their wings are also this sort of violet blue. They're really beautiful. But the males of that same species look completely different. So they have green eyes and orange fur covering their black underskin. Yeah, they look like little aliens. When I first moved to Florida, I'm originally from the Midwest. I was like, what are these bees? These are so cool. So yeah, and that's actually the 5th most commonly observed bee species here in Florida. So they're super common. Like I said, really early in the spring, that's when you'll see them the most. And they have these wonderful, funny behaviors. So if you happen to see them and you just kind of sit down and watch, they sort of put on a show for you because they're kind of goofy bees, I guess is how I would describe them. And then the more serious cousin to the Xylic is Xylic Virginica. So this is just called the Eastern Carpenter Bee, and it has a wider range up and down the East Coast. Again, the males and females look slightly different, which is why I included this smaller photo here. You can see the males actually have a yellow nose, is what it looks like. So that's how you can distinguish them from the females. But again, to your point in the back earlier, you can see this sort of shiny part right here, and it's just a lack of hair. But yeah, both of these are really wonderful, and you'll see the Xylic a little bit more than the Xylic virginica, but you'll see Virginica sort of more throughout the year, and again, has a wider distribution. Here we go, leafcutter bees. These are so great. So these are also solitary and they nest in cavities, but unlike carpenter bees, they don't chew those cavities. Instead, they chew pieces of plant material and then they line their nests with that. So it sort of forms this like vegetative tube inside of a wooden structure. So maybe you guys have seen these sort of perfectly circular cutouts from plant leaves. Those are leafcutter bees usually. And they'll cut them out and they kind of bundle them up and carry them away. I mean, what's not to love, right? They're so cute. They're just wonderful. But I really wanted to talk to you guys about this particular species because as you can see, it looks just like, does anybody remember the name of the southern carpenter bee that I just talked about, iridescent blue? The Xylic, right? They look just alike. So this is actually a wonderful case of evolutionary mimicry that we see in this leafcutter bee. So the bee is over here in the larger photo, the leafcutter, but I have for comparison the carpenter bee right next to it. So it's actually mimicking those, which is really cool. It's a little bit smaller, and the way that you distinguish them is actually where they carry their pollen. So the female leafcutter bees have pollen collecting hairs on their stomachs. So they have these yellow patches of hair. I don't know in this, I'm gonna pass the leafcutter bee box around and kind of hold it to the side and look at the female, and you'll see she's covered in yellow pollen on her belly. Yes.
Do they have particular plants they like to cut?
That's such a good question. I think they don't like to cut things that are latexy, you know, sort of the typical things insects don't like to go to, they won't cut from usually. But there's no real knowledge about which ones they prefer. I think it's sort of opportunistic, I guess I would say. Yes. Yes, I actually have that. I'll just kind of skip down here to the bottom just to ask you if this is what you're talking about. Like that? Yeah, those are for leafcutter bees. And I'll talk more about how we can promote bee nesting habitat here in just a little bit. But so you can also see that the male of this species also looks like the male Southern Carpenter Bee, right? It has that sort of orangish fur, the iridescent wings, and it's a little bit smaller than the female, just very similar. I think it's a wonderful thing to point out. And again, these are some of the most common bees. This species is the 8th most common bee that is observed here in Florida. Okay, so for this next one, I'm actually going to open the slide fully so you guys can see the material. Let's see. Perfect. Okay. So this is another notable Florida bee. This is the Southeastern Blueberry Bee, which you guys saw in the box, right? The little blueberry bee specimen. So this is actually the bee that I'm doing most of my dissertation work on. So of course I had to include it in the talk, but it is also the 9th most commonly observed bee here in Florida. And you can distinguish it from other bees because it looks like it's wearing a hula skirt is the best way I can describe it. It has this sort of yellow tan strip across its back. And then the rest of the back, the rest of the abdomen is hairless. So that's how you can distinguish it from bumblebees. And this, similar to the Southern Carpenter Bee, is one of the first bees that you will see in the spring. And it is really important anecdotally, in my opinion, for pollinating commercial blueberry plants on smaller farms. Typically organic small farms will have really large populations of these bees, and it's important for pollinating, you know, many of our 8 wild blueberry species that are native to Florida as well. And I wanted to show you this video. I hope it pops up. So they're blueberry specialists and they're ground nesting. Let's see. Ah, yes, it's working. So you can see I actually took this video of a female Southeastern Blueberry Bee excavating a ground nest. When I watch this, I just think, wow, that has to be so much work. I mean, look at her. She's facing sort of a mountain of soil in her mind, right? But this is a pretty special observation. This is the first and only video of this happening that's ever been recorded. Yes.
What is the scenario that there?
Oh, good question. So this is sloped soil. So it was actually in a fire break, and it is a huge like truck rut. And it was digging into the side. So you can imagine, you know, you have this slope where the truck's been driving, and it's digging right into here. Very cool. Often ground nesting bees will prefer sloped soils. Okay. Let's see. Perfect. And the last species that's particular that I want to talk about is the green orchid bee. Have you all seen this bee here in Leu Gardens? So I had to include it. First of all, it's the number 7 most commonly observed bee here in Florida. And I think that's in part just because it looks so strange. And so people, you know, they take pictures and they upload it because they're like, what is this crazy thing? But also, I actually have seen pretty significant populations of bees out in the pollinator garden here at Leu Gardens. So I thought, well, I have to include it, right? And these are really fascinating bees. So they're actually not native to Florida, although they're sort of naturalized, maybe. There's some discussion about that. They were introduced to South Florida in 2003 and have been working their way northward ever since. So here in Orlando, we pretty much have the most northern point of these bees in the whole hemisphere, really. And they're crazy because males actually will collect floral volatiles as opposed to nectar or pollen from plants, and then they use that to attract females. Yeah, so I guess it's all about, that's what it's all about in the end for everybody, right? Yeah, so they have these interesting structures. You can sort of see here on the hind leg, it has a basket, but not like what you would see on a honeybee, right? Clearly a basket for collecting more volatile substances, right? Very cool. So just to recap, we have one, the most commonly observed bee here in Florida, the green sweat bee. Two, Bombus impatiens, or I think it's just called the common bumblebee. It's a common name for it. Three, Halictus poyi or poyi sweat bee. Four, Bombus pennsylvanicus, the eastern bumblebee. Five, and one of my favorites, Xylic. Six, Xylic Virginica, the eastern Carpenter Bee. Seven, the green orchid bee. Eight, the leaf cutter that I talked about, that's the mimic of number 5. 9, the Southeastern Blueberry Bee, and 10, Bombus griseoculus, another bumblebee. So I just love this sort of photo layout because you can really see the diversity of bees that we have here in Florida. It's really, to me, it's quite stunning and wonderful, and it's encouraging to see. So just to share a few tools with you guys, we have, like I mentioned before, if you're interested in learning about bumblebees specifically, just Google UF-IFAS Bumblebee ID. And it's like the first PDF that will pop up, and it'll talk about how you examine the hair patterns, and it'll talk about different antenna locations. It's really quite a nice guide. Additionally, we have the Florida Native Bees group. Is anybody a member of that? It's on Facebook. Yes, it's like my favorite Facebook group after Florida Flora Ecosystematics, which I know many of you are probably a part of. But you should really join this group. It's wonderful. You can also take photos of bees and post them, and really knowledgeable people will identify them for you. And it's just a great way to learn about the bees of Florida. And then finally, we have, again, iNaturalist, and specifically, we actually have a Florida Native Bees project. So you can go into iNaturalist and just look at the Florida Native Bees posts. And again, that's a wonderful place to put pictures and get IDs if you're not familiar. Okay, so now that we've talked about all the wonderful bees, how do we protect them? I think that's a question a lot of people are interested in, sort of what can I do from my stance? Many people have heard in the media that bees are really imperiled. Many of the species are struggling due to land use change, due to lack of resources, and a multitude of other things having to do with people, right? So what can we as people do to protect the bees? And there are 3 main components to this that are pretty simple that you can really implement on a local scale and have an impact. So the first is we have to provide floral resources for the bees. Bees consume exclusively pollen and nectar. I mean, they might consume other things on accident, but really that's what they're eating is pollen and nectar. And so if they don't have that, they're not going to be doing well, right? The second is nesting habitat. Like I mentioned earlier, here in Florida, we have a pretty diverse array of nesting strategies for our bees. Some of them nest below ground, some of them nest in wood, some in leaf-lined cavities. And we really need to protect those resources for bees as well. And finally, protection. And this is really protection from chemical exposure, right? From pesticides and herbicides. Okay. So I like to say that there are a few floral rules of thumb for bees. Does anybody have a pollinator garden here? Yes, or would like to have a pollinator garden here? Yes, great, it's great. So the first thing that's really important is to think like a bee. So if you imagine, these little tiny bees are flying across the landscape and they're visually identifying floral resources that they can go to. So one of the most important things that you need to do is to plant in clumps so that those floral resources are apparent to bees that are searching for them. So plant in clumps, that's the first floral rule of thumb for bees. Additionally, and you guys will all like this, provide both nectar and pollen. So a lot of times you'll go into a pollinator garden that exclusively has nectar producing plants and none of them have pollen. It's like, well, pollen is the only protein resource for bees. They have to have it. So you have to plant plants that produce pollen, and native plants typically do. So we're in the right place, right? Plant more natives. And provide bees with pollen. It's really important. Also, nectar plants are great, and these are often non-native. Some of our pentas or our non-native lantanas, they're really popular, and you'll see pollinators stopping at them. They do provide an important resource, but they can't be the only resource. And so obviously the plants can't be sterile, right? If you're planting for pollen, you don't want to have sterile plants, which often is desirable for ornamental decoration on a big scale. It's hard to convince people that they should plant non-sterile plants for whatever reason. Okay. Additionally, we need to plant for blooms year-round. So particularly here in Florida, as I mentioned, we have a few bee species that actually come out and are thoroughly active in January and February. So we need to make sure that we have blooms for those species to go to. I have a couple suggestions here. Additionally, any of our native blueberry plants typically bloom pretty early. My favorite is Vaccinium mercenites, personally. It's just my favorite native blueberry. Yeah. But we also need to have late blooming plants. And part of the reason for this is, like I said, we have these bumblebee queens taking off on their sort of hibernation flights, right? And they need to be able to access floral resources during that time so that they can prepare for the winter properly and overwinter successfully to produce another colony the next year. Yes.
And Genesis fasciculata, the partridge bee, is our earliest summer blooming plant. So just it blooms late July, August, it starts to come out. So after going through a summertime with not much food, that's the first one to come on and start feeding all these bees.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, the partridge bee. Yeah, and we do have a dearth of floral resources in the summer, as we all know, because it's really hot and plants don't like it. They don't want to bloom during the summer here in Florida. And then, of course, some of these more obvious plants down here at the bottom, sunflower, your blanket flowers, which I know the one that we plant a lot is not native, but the native version of that. Bee bombs, etc. Some of the ones that you see in your typical pollinator garden, those are great. And typically they'll bloom late. Bees prefer yellows, whites, blues, and purples for attractiveness. So a lot of times people will plant red plants for bees, but they actually see in a different spectrum than we do. And so red is not as readily apparent to them. Bees also will use guides. They have UV guides on plants that a lot of times will catch their attention that we can't even see. And flower shape is also very important. So you can see here, I have this sort of funny picture of a honeybee butt sticking out of the soap aloe flower. You see that? Yeah. But, most bees, like what I was talking about earlier, they're a lot of times they're larger bodied than that. Even the small ones are wider than that, right? So planting with flat flowers is much better and is going to be able to help a variety of bees, whereas planting with these like long tubular flowers is not as beneficial to a multitude of bees. I find that people are often specifically interested in attracting bumblebees, which I understand, they're wonderful. Bumblebees really prefer the blues and purples. You can see here, I have, actually, that's a bumblebee on Vicinium mercenites down there in the bottom. Yeah. So they'll do blues, purples, and whites, which for some reason I left off here. And they can reach into short and medium tube length flowers. So they don't necessarily have to have those flat flowers, but it's good if they're not super long tubes, you know, so keeping them a little shorter. And like I mentioned before, they really, really, really need blooms all year round, because we have the queens who are going off to overwinter in the fall, and then we have the queens who are super active really, really early in the spring trying to start their colonies. And at both of those times, it's critical that we have resources for bumblebees. And because they're some of my favorites, plants for sweat bees as well. And really the take-home message here is if you have weedy plants and you can leave them alone, do leave them alone, because that is what the sweat bees love. You can see I captured this photo. This is Helicopyi in flight here. Smaller flowers, typically flowers from spring to fall, so making sure to get some of those summer flowers during that dearth of bloom. And again, flat flowers, and they prefer whites and yellows. Okay. Now on to the second step for bee conservation, nesting habitat. This is one of my favorite topics because no one talks about it. People will tell you all day what you should plant, and you can Google all day what you should plant, but no one's really putting out information on what you need to do in your landscape as far as nesting for bees goes. So we actually have, of our top 10 species, number 1, 3, and 9. So that's the green sweat bee, Poyai sweat bee, and the Southeastern Blueberry Bee, all nest in the ground. So earlier I showed you guys that video of a blueberry bee digging into the ground. So these, all 3 have that type of nesting strategy. And here's just a little diagram of it. So you can see they'll dig sort of a straight down nest and have shafts off to the side where they lay an egg, which will turn into a larvae, which feeds on that yellow pollen and nectar ball. So what that looks like from our point of view, our perspective standing above ground, is this smaller photo that I have here. Has anyone ever seen these sort of little volcano-like? Yeah, those can be bee nests, not always. One good way to tell is to put a jar over it at night, come out early in the morning and sit there and watch and see what comes up. It's a thought. I've done it many times. It's a surefire way to tell what's going to come out of a hole, is to put a jar over it. But that's what it looks like above ground. And I actually love this photo that I took because this was in sort of like some landscaping gravel next to one of my apartment doors. It was literally right outside of my door, maybe like a foot away from my apartment entrance. And there was an insanely large aggregation of cellophane bees, which I didn't talk about today because they're less common. But it really just sort of shows that when you have the right soil type and people who aren't disturbing it, that you can get bees to nest. And really what that means, I think I have another video here. Maybe it'll pop up. Aw, my video is kind of squishy. But anyways, you can see her digging away. This is a cellophane bee, Colonies thoracicus. Again, it's one of the less common ones, but you can see her just digging right between this decorative gravel. They really require, though, well-drained soil. You want it to be relatively bare. And in particular, I put this at the end, but no yard cloth for bees. That is really a detriment. And as we know, it can be a detriment to other things as well. But for bees who are trying to dig holes into the ground, it really prevents them from nesting there. Additionally, the spot should be relatively sunny and untilled. So if you do any tilling, that's of course going to, destroy any bee nests that are in that location. I think this is really an important topic about ground nesting bees. So globally, actually 70% of our bee species, of that 20,000 I talked about at the beginning, are ground nesting. So most bee species require this type of habitat. And in In a world where we are putting more and more impermeable surface down, it's really important to maintain this type of place when you can. Just want to make my little plug for ground nesting bees. So we also, of course, have our cavity and wood nesters. So here we have the southern Carpenter Bee, the eastern Carpenter Bee, and our lovely leaf cutter, number 8. And here we go to that slide that I skipped to earlier. It's important for these if you can leave some dead wood, undisturbed wood around, because for Carpenter bees, oftentimes they'll make nests in that. And for cavity nesting bees, other things will drill holes into it and then they'll come along the next year and make a nest in it. Additionally, you can try providing bee houses, such as this sort of smaller one that I have up here. Has anyone tried this? The bee houses? Yeah, have you had success at all? That's what I always hear. Yeah, so the pieces will fall out, or sometimes you'll get wasps or flies or other things in there. I think just a few tips for success if you are going to try it, because I do think it's a good thing to try. Although I think oftentimes that these organisms prefer to nest in natural habitats, right? So whenever we have our perfectly shaped little reeds, they're like, what is this? You know. But if you are going to try it, make sure that you get the bee house liners. They're just these paper liners, and the bees can easily build nests inside of those, and replace those every 2 to 3 years. And what that helps do is prevent fungal, bacterial buildup in the nests. And additionally, for a similar reason, you want to move the bee houses from location to location every couple of years, because otherwise they'll become a target for pests and parasites. Okay, now on to bumblebee nesting. So again, we have Bombus impatiens, Pennsylvanicus, and Griseoculus here, our top 3 Florida bumblebee species. And bumblebees have a more complicated life cycle than many of the bee species. So, you know, again, we have these queens who are flying off on their own, so they need a place to overwinter. So it's important to leave garden leaf litter and other leaf litter places sort of undisturbed, because sometimes bumblebee queens will actually be sort of just under the surface, hanging out there all winter. And then additionally, bumblebees need places for their larger colonies, which oftentimes are in undisturbed brush. So we have like a brush pile that's not really doing too much, you know, sort of out on the edge of your property. If you can leave that alone, it could be used by bumblebees. Additionally, just kind of not disturbing, I guess, the soil and the leaf litter in the landscape as much as possible. It's kind of a golden rule for bees in general, and for a lot of other things, right? If we want our homes to be ecosystems, then we need to treat them like that. And the same follows for bee nesting. Oh, skipped ahead a little bit too much. So the final component to bee conservation is protection from chemicals in particular. So bees have multiple routes of exposure to pesticides. I don't know how many of you use pesticides in your home. Probably not very many, given our mutual interests here, probably not that many. But it's also important to be an advocate for your community, right? When the chance arises, or it can be important to support businesses that maybe don't use as many pesticides, because they can really, really affect bees. And more literature is coming out in the science world about the negative effects of pesticides and herbicides that we thought were inoculate or sort of non-harmful for bees, but now we've learned actually can cause bee declines. A paper just came out recently that was sort of a review of everything that's been published about Roundup, or glyphosate in particular, that found consistent bee declines with increasing glyphosate usage per like acre or whatever in a given area. And there's been some pushback on that, people saying, well, we've tested in the lab, it hasn't really, you know, affected the bees in the lab. But we see that as an accumulation of research happens, that these things are bad for bees. So in the meantime, before we get the, I guess, the final say on that scientific controversy, it's important to limit bee exposure to these things. And exposure can happen through dust and spray droplets, obviously, through pollen and nectar that plants that have systemic pesticides in them are producing through water, because bees do drink water, and through mutation droplets. So have you ever seen a honeybee sort of messing with aphids? Has anyone seen this? Honeybees will actually drink the honeydew that aphids produce, which is kind of gross when you think about it, but they do. And so do other bees. And so that can be another route of exposure. It's important to remember that risk for bees is toxicity and also exposure. So the first thing we need to do is limit exposure. So do not spray plants that are in bloom if you can avoid it. Don't do it. Particularly flowering weeds, because that is a major source of floral resources for bees. Additionally, try to spray very early or very late in the day when bees are not active. Of course, we want to sort of follow our pesticide and herbicide procedures, follow and spray in only low wind and moderate temperature, and in general, minimize chemicals, which it seems like most of us are probably doing here, you know, trying to be responsible and cognizant of what we use. But that's really important for protecting our bees. So I put this photo here because, you know, you see this sort of what a lot of people would consider to be a very aggravating weed, you know, those giant purple thistles that we have. But pollinators love them, and I think they're beautiful. See, they're very pretty. But I mean, you'll see huge amounts of diversity on one single bloom on these plants. And people will go along and spray them, and that's really exposing bees to those pesticides. Or in that case, I guess, herbicides. But. And then the other component of this is, of course, toxicity. So the more toxic it is for bees, the worse it is. And of course, our pesticides and herbicides typically have a toxicity rating on them. So we can read that label. We can know what the residual activity is. In general, we want to make sure that we're using low residual activity pesticides and herbicides. And this includes systemic pesticides. So if you're purchasing plants that have been treated with pesticides that are systemic, that are uptaken through the plant, then bees can be exposed through the pollen and nectar to that chemical. And I think that's probably the most insidious way that pollinators are introduced to these things, right? Because a lot of times people, even plants for pollinators that people plant in their gardens or their homes, will be treated with these systemic pesticides. It's like, well, you know, so who knows? I mean, it doesn't really seem, I don't want to say it's not beneficial at all to plant those, but it can certainly increase exposure of toxic chemicals to the bees. So making sure to look for untreated starts or seeds is really important. Yes.
Some of the toxicity also talks about honeybees being domesticated. They're constantly exposed to pesticides with a higher tolerance, as we talk about field spray, and native bees zero exposure, zero tolerance. So the toxicity of a honeybee exposure is different than a native bee, and most of the research is probably honeybees.
Right. So just to kind of repeat for the Zoom group, you're basically saying that the toxicity level for a honeybee is going to be different than a native bee because honeybees have been exposed to these things for a longer period of time. And I think that there's a lot of merit to that statement. And what I will say is that we certainly do not know how these pesticides affect most of our native bee species. Like there's never been a study on how, I don't know, glyphosate affects the Southeastern Blueberry Bee, right? There's never been that study. So we really don't know that information, which is why, yeah, it's important to just limit exposure as much as we can because we don't know what the outcomes would be. And they could be worse for honeybees. I mean, alternatively, I guess they could be better, but, but we just don't know. And with that, I just want to give you guys some information on how to stay connected with me, with each other, and with other bee people. So please join that Florida Native Bees Facebook group. I cannot discuss enough how great it is. And the person who runs it is so cool and knowledgeable. She gives a lot of talks and she likes to post those on the group. So it's really worthwhile. Additionally, check out iNaturalist. If you're not already on there, it's a wonderful way to connect with like-minded people. Again, please follow me on Instagram if you'd like to see bee photos. I actually took, I would say, most of the photos that you saw today. And then the Malinger Lab that I'm a part of, Shiala, who was here earlier but had to leave, actually runs the Twitter page and keeps us up to date with all things bee. So if you're on Twitter, definitely follow that. Okay, and I'm just going to put my contact info up here while we transition into what I believe is going to be a very fun portion of today's meeting, right? And a plant giveaway. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Questions, of course. Anybody?
On the toxicity and stuff,
Yes.
you know, I can make sure I don't spray anything in my yard, but I can't stop the city from spraying for mosquitoes. How bad is that for pollinators when they spray, you know?
That's a great question. So mosquito spray, I actually trust a lot more than other sprays. And here's why. Because people who are trying to control mosquito populations, first of all, have the mindset of only controlling for mosquitoes. So typically mosquito controls are very specified to that group. So a lot of times they'll use things that actually cannot affect other organisms. And additionally, sort of, it's kind of a cost benefit ratio, right? You have to think about it. I mean, not saying that we should just spray for everything, but mosquitoes are a disease carrying pest here in Florida. So, and I think our mosquito control people are doing pretty good work here, particularly in Florida. We actually have a lot of innovation that happens in mosquito control right here in Florida. It's very cool. Recently, I believe were recently approved by the FDA to release sterile mosquitoes. Have you guys heard about this? Sterile insect technique. So the idea is that you release a population that will mate with the natural population and essentially prevent them from actually reproducing. So over time, they'll have fewer and fewer mosquitoes. So we're always trying to do new ideas for mosquito control. Yes.
Several questions that you could probably answer in more critical answers, but you said that the honeybees were not native. Where did they come from and how long have they been here?
Such a good question.
Are the bee mites that are a problem in their colonies a problem with the natives? And should the natives take the place of honeybees with regard to pollinating the commercial crops that good honeybees basically get wiped out?
Well, those three questions. So one, how long have honeybees been here if they're not native? Two, do the pests and pathogens and parasites in general that honeybees have affect native pollinators? And three, could native pollinators replace honeybees commercially? Those are great questions. I mean, that's what we're doing in bee research right now, are those three questions. So first of all, honeybees are from Europe. We also have Asian honeybees, but the one we have here is the European honeybee. It's actually been here since the Columbian Exchange. People brought honeybee colonies over. So they've been here multiple centuries at this point. To answer your second question, do the pests, parasites, and pathogens of honeybees affect native bees? Yes, in some cases they do. And there are a number of studies that examine particularly how pathogens are transferred from honeybees to native bees via the flower. So after honeybee visits, it can actually leave behind things that then a native bee can pick up. And that's that's one argument for why we should limit honeybee usage in certain areas, is that exactly. And then finally, can we replace honeybees with native bees? I think people are trying, and I think that's great. So there are particular bee species that do a great job of pollinating some crops. For example, we have squash bees that do most of our squash pollination here in the United States. We don't really use honeybees there. In watermelon, often those are completely wild bee pollinated. But there are certain industries like the blueberry industry here in Florida where we do have native bees, such as the southern Carpenter Bee and the Southeastern Blueberry Bee that will visit those plants. But the majority of the pollination is done with honeybees. And I think there is some research into trying to transition, and that's actually some of the work. I've done a little bit of that work, but it presents so many challenges because we know so little about almost all of these species. So it's kind of an uphill climb. One interesting area of research that is happening is actually trying to make plants less reliant on pollinators, commercial plants, so that we don't have to have as much honeybee pollination. Yes.
Along that line, I recently saw a video, and there's a couple companies now, and they are collecting masonry beads
Yes.
and then redistributing them as a product that you can use to pollinate your garden in lieu of honeybees. So people are doing, instead of beekeeping honeybees, they're beekeeping masonry.
Yes. And actually, I'm going to go back to a picture. You guys probably didn't notice it earlier because I was talking about something else. But this photo right here, do you see the bottom right, or the bottom photo here? This is a leafcutter bee actually shipped out from Washington State in these boards. And these were in a farmer's farm. Yeah, and I took this picture on a farmer's farm. So this is an up and coming area. People are so interested in this right now. Also, honeybees are super expensive for farmers to keep. I mean, because they have to rent them or purchase them, and there's upkeep and pesticide treatments and, you know, on and on. So I think everybody is interested in this question. And it is true that you can actually purchase bumblebees, mason bees, and leafcutter bees online and have them shipped to your house, which sort of like plants though, we have to think and be cognizant of the transference of one species to another area and what that could potentially do to the environment. And I think that question's not being asked as much as it could be in that setting, but it is sort of a cool thing that's starting to become more and more popular.
Yeah, the one company I saw in this video, they actually have, they have people from different parts of the country ship their bees to them. And so if you want Florida mason bees, you order those and you get ones that are native to you.
Do you remember what the name of the company that does this bee distribution was called?
YouTube video, you probably do YouTube.
Cool.
Search YouTube for mason bee, exchange or something. It was really interesting. It sounded like they were really trying to find ways to completely replace honeybees.
Yeah, like I said, it's up and coming. We're trying to apply it to a lot of different industries. Yes.
Anybody work on, because honeybees are grown basically in commercial hives, like in factories or something. Has anybody done any research on trying to create natural honeybee colonies in the Florida, the wild around different farms and stuff, rather than just having them so that you would go with the natural life cycle and you have all that.
Right.
Hive.
Yeah, that's a good question. So are people looking into utilizing honeybees that occur naturally, although like I said, not native, right? But naturally in the environment as opposed to commercially kept colonies? I think the answer to that is yes. And we actually have a significant number of what are called feral honeybee colonies that are just about and around. And beekeepers.
Sort of cultivating them, so if you're environment you cultivate, you would try and get colonies in the trees or something instead of having to build the nest.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the problems with that is just that honeybees can be transient, right? They can start a new colony, a new location. So people oftentimes are trying to implement, I guess, scenarios in which the honeybees will stay, right? And it is a challenge, but people are really interested in that question about what feral honeybees can do and what we can do for them. Do we have time for more questions?
One last question.
Okay, one more question.
Still regarding honeybees, had a Colonies once that had space around the electrical conduit on the top, and honeybees got in there. And
Yikes.
I had a double sliding door, they didn't come inside. I had a double sliding door, and I could look out on the patio, and certain times of the year, there were lots of bees, probably disoriented on the ground, broken around in circles and so on. Did they start some whales at some point? honeybee colony.
Do they purge males in the honeybee colony? They do. Yes. Although, you know, that what you saw could be a number of honeybee behaviors. So I won't say that that's necessarily what it was, but they do that. They do kick out the males at some point after their usage is done, I guess. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody here for your great questions and participation. It's been really fun.